It's good to be here, Steve.
We had a lot of fun last week in our opportunity to study God's Word, and we were looking at this concept of the spirit, soul, and body. And let's kind of look at that again for just a few minutes if you want to do that.
Well, we learned that our spirit, souls, and bodies function and operate as God's love bank. And when we begin to define our spirit is the real person. It's the real us. Our soul is our personality, and our bodies is the house that the spirit lives in. When we begin to look at the notion of our spirit, souls, and bodies functioning and operating as God's love bank, then we go to several scriptures. For example, the one passage, and probably one of my favorite parables, is the parable of the talent. You remember the story about the 5-talent man, the 2-talent man, and the 1-talent man. Well, you know, the 5-talent and 2-talent man, they took their talents and they invested in the bank of their souls in a way that they were pleasing in the sight of their master. But the 1-talent man, he made a statement such as this. He said, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you've sown not, and sowing where you've not reaped. And I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. And as a result of that, you remember the master responded by saying, you wicked and slothful servant, you should have taken my talents. By the way, Steve, the word talent, the word money, and goods are used synonymously in this parable.
Right.
In other words, you should have taken my goods. Mm-hmm. You should have taken my talents. You should have taken my money. And he went and he used this banking language. And you should have deposited it in the bank so that when I come, I would receive mine back with interest. Notice the banking language that Jesus uses in this parable. And when we look at this parable, when it talks about the man going into this far-off country, this is talking about Jesus going away, and he's going to come back in his second coming.
Right.
When it talks about the man, that's referring to all humanity. And so when we are investing in the bank of our souls, what we're doing is we are using our talents, our goods, and our money. Or in other words, when you put all that together, whatever God has blessed us with, we can invest in the bank of our souls to bring about profits for God.
And that's, we talked about that last week, the fact that God gives us the privilege to be able to invest in ourselves. He gives us the freedom and the personal responsibility to do that. And we see that from that parable. And also the investment language. A lot of the parables that we read have banking language associated with that.
19 out of the 26 parables of Jesus refer to this notion of investing, this notion of expanding, this notion of making deposits and withdrawals, in essence, in the bank of our souls.
Right. Well, in regards to that, I mean, one of the things we want to talk about tonight is the origin. How did God's love bank come about? And I know we want to discuss that for our listening audience tonight.
I think it's appropriate also tonight because I'm excited about a special guest that we're going to have on the show. You can introduce him later, but I just want to mention that I'm just excited to have Dr. Heath Burns,
right,
the Superintendent of Abilene Independent School Districts, with us tonight, because my story started out like this. At 16, I dropped out of school because I couldn't read. I couldn't read a sentence. And as a result of that, I felt worthless. I felt like nobody. I found myself doing negative, defeating, sabotaging things, but I didn't understand why. Well, to make a long story short, I stayed out of school for 5.5 years. And then at 22, I made up my mind that I was going to go back to school after a very challenging thing happening to one of my close friends, my best friend. I decided to go back to school at the age of 22, but I discovered I couldn't read. And so my first challenge was to learn how to read. I sequestered myself in the basement of my parents' home. And some days I would be in my basement, my parents' basement, from 6 o'clock in the morning to past 12 o'clock midnight. And day after day, I was determined. I doggedly taught myself to read. And then before long, I began to notice words coming out of my mouth like multi-generational transmission and collaboration. And I discovered that I could read. After discovering I could read, I decided to go back to school to get my high school diploma. I wanted to go back to the classroom because I failed in the classroom. You see, when I was in school, I had poor reading and writing skills, which I later learned when I was working on my master's degree, that when you have poor reading and writing skills, the teenager tends to become delinquent or disruptive because they are too embarrassed to stay in the classroom and read. Well, to make a long story short, I went back to the 10th grade. I was the oldest grown man in the class.
My goodness.
But I was so determined to get my high school diploma. Eventually, in a year and a half, I got my high school diploma. Then I got an AA degree, and then I got a BA degree, and then I got a master's degree, and ultimately I got a doctor's degree. And I got my doctor's degree at Abilene Christian University. And now I have a message to young people called "The Dropout Has Become a Doctor." But the interesting thing is, while I was working on my doctoral thesis, I did research to try to help myself understand what was causing me to do this negative, defeating, sabotaging things, and yet I was doing it with the sincere intent to love myself. And then I discovered that that tendency is a concept, a phenomenon called old self-love. It makes you do these negative, sabotaging, destructive things, and yet you're doing it to love yourself.
And for me, now that was life-changing for me, because you found out in your research that it wasn't just individual, but the whole world deals with this type of concept of old self-love.
As a matter of fact, during my project thesis and my doctoral thesis, I was targeting males, and then I discovered through further research that all human beings have this tendency of old self-love. Whether they are rich or poor, black or white, whether they grew up on the right side of the track or the left side of the track, it really doesn't matter. It is a human condition that drives us, and it's driving people today. We see it on Wall Street. We see it on your street. We see it in our homes. It's everywhere. We see it in the father who loves his child but don't know what to do to stop these negative tendencies, or the mother who loves her children but she keeps going back to the bottle. And yet she wants to love her children, but she can't stop herself. It's called old self-love.
You know, we also discovered that it's a biblical concept. Ephesians talks about the fact of the old and the new man, the old self and the new self.
Yes.
And so a lot of times people feel that it's not biblical, but actually it is biblically based, and it finds itself in that as well.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we can go back as far as what the Bible and the Hebrew people call the Hebrew Shema. The Hebrew Shema is based on Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. This is the first and great commandment in the law." And then he says to the fathers, and I want you fathers to take this in your home and put them on the frontlets of the door. Talk about it in your house when you walk in the house, and when you are with your children. This concept was called the Hebrew Shema. It was the watchword of Israel. It is the basis of new self-love. Then Jesus picks the concept up in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. And then in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 32, he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. This is the first and great commandment in the law." But get this, but the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now here's the basic premise of new self-love. As I learn to love God, I learn to love myself. And as I learn to love myself, I learn to love my fellow man, my neighbor, starting with the closest person to me, whether that's a child who has a parent or a parent who has a child. And so the basis of this notion of new self-love is picked up by Paul now in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 22 through 24. Steve, I hope you don't mind me mentioning these scriptures. I'm just one of those Bible-based kind of.
That's it.
Paul picks it up and he says in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 22, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life." I'm quoting it verbatim. "You were taught with regard to your former way of life," in the NIV. "You were taught with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self and its deceitful lust, and to be made new in the spirit of your mind."